Good afternoon. My name is Ira Brown, and I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar called Beyond Macros, Automating Microsoft Project for Non-Techies. I think we'll have a fun and interesting time this afternoon getting exposed to some of the automation capabilities of Microsoft Project. And we will be going through a number of examples where you can see how automation can be created for Project and how it can even integrate Project with other Office applications. And we will be taking questions. As I present, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the GoToMeeting panel. And at a couple points during today's session, we will take a look at those questions, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. Before we get started, just a quick word about who we are. Project Widgets is a Microsoft Project Gold partner and solution provider, and I've been at this now for well over 20 years, delivering Microsoft Project consulting services, and also contributed to a number of books on Microsoft Project. And we work with companies in many different industries that are all using Microsoft Project and want to get better at using it and making it easier for people to use. So Project Widgets will do full Microsoft Project implementations, including Project Server and Project Online, and consulting and training services to help organizations use Project in a way that works for their business and helps them meet their requirements. And one of the things that we specialize in is creating custom solutions for Microsoft Project that often turn into add-on products, which we refer to as our widgets. And really that's kind of what today's session is about. It's how do we customize Microsoft Project to make our jobs easier? And that all can start off with understanding macros. That's really kind of the foundation of a lot of these kinds of automation capabilities that we have. So let's get right into it. So as far as today's agenda, we are going to start at the very beginning. How do we create a macro? Well, we can actually record a macro using the macro recorder that comes with Microsoft Project. So we'll see how we can do that. And then once we record our macro, we can see how we are able to then assign that macro to the ribbon in Microsoft Project and actually create our own custom ribbon tab and our own buttons that can call our custom macros that we create. And then we'll go through our first example, creating an automated printing routine, where suppose we need to produce some reports on a regular basis. And in order to produce those reports, you have to apply various views or maybe apply various filters to get the data looking the way you want. And then once you do that, you have to click the print button, then move on to the next one. Well, what if we could come up with a way to take all of those kinds of reports you have to produce each week and just put them on a single button and have them all print in sequence, and now your job's done. So that's the whole idea of macros, is to take something that you do frequently that just takes up time and makes it easier for you to accomplish. We're also then going to look at some other examples, some a little bit more sophisticated examples where we could perhaps use the macro recorder to get us started, but then I'm going to actually show you how we can go in and tweak that code a bit to do some even more powerful things. For example, the ability to create a routine that can inflate or deflate the work by some specified percentage. We'll also see how we can import information from Microsoft Excel. So we'll see some of the integration capabilities between Project and other Office applications. And then we're going to create something I refer to as the Zoom text widget. You could actually download this for free from our website, but we're actually going to create it together, and you'll get some experience of, once again, recording macros, tweaking the macros a little bit to suit your purpose, and then assigning those macros to buttons on the ribbon. We'll also talk about, once you've created these macros, how do you distribute them to other users? So how do we make them available from just your instance of Microsoft Project to other people within your organization that may benefit from using these kinds of tools? And then we'll wrap up by something called the widget showcase. We're going to take a look at one of the widgets that we do sell, which we call our project initiation widget, which is something that we make available for organizations to help standardize the process for initiating a new project. And we'll get into that in more detail a little bit later in the session. So with that, let's get right into it. So how do you know when a macro would be useful? Well, it's a good idea to target a task that is tedious, time-consuming, complicated, error-prone, basically things that you do on a regular basis that you know, sometimes could take you an hour or two to do, and maybe involve some data entry, and if you don't get the numbers just right, you know, you could have some problems. This is a way of not only saving you time, but making things you know, just more error-free and bulletproof. So we'll go through several examples of some things that I think are good candidates for a macro. One of the most important things as you're going through this thought process is think about how you would accomplish what you're trying to do manually. If you know, for the most part, anything that you can do manually in Microsoft Project can be automated via the macro language of Project. So it's important that you first understand how would you accomplish the thing you're looking to do manually, and then from there figure out what are the logical steps to automate it. Once you have that kind of worked out in your head, the easiest way to get started is generally to record a macro. We'll see how we can turn on the macro recorder, and then we're actually going to go through those manual steps while the macro recorder is running, and then we'll actually get to take a look at the code that gets generated as a result of recording that macro. We will then edit and fine-tune that macro as needed to suit our purpose, and then once you have it pretty well worked out and you want to just make it easier to run that macro, you can just assign that macro to a button on your ribbon. One of the things I'll also mention is sometimes people ask me, what version of Microsoft Project can these macros run in? Well, you could actually go back all the way to Microsoft Project 4.0, which is sometime in the, well, I'd say 1993 timeframe. That's when macros were first introduced into Microsoft Project. And believe it or not, I could take macros that I created for Microsoft Project 4.0 or Project 95 or 98 or 2000 or on, all the way up through the latest version, which is 2016. And for the most part, those macros would work in any version of Microsoft Project, which is really great. So sometimes people are concerned, what if I spend all this time creating this automation in Project 2010 and then my organization upgrades to Project 2013? Not a problem. And the reason for that is because the Microsoft Project application is still working with the same kinds of things it worked with back in version 4.0. There's still tasks, there's resources, there's assignments, there's calendars, there's views. All those kinds of things that you can work with in Project are part of what's called the Microsoft Project object model, and that has remained consistent from version to version. So as new features are introduced into Microsoft Project, the macro language gets more robust, but sort of the basic fundamentals really don't change from one version to the other. So that's something pretty good to know. The other thing that's worth mentioning too is that even though we're focused today on Microsoft Project, the macro language that Microsoft Project uses is actually called Visual Basic for Applications. That's the built-in programming language to Microsoft Project, and the same programming language is part of other Office applications like Word and Excel and PowerPoint and even Microsoft Outlook. So the techniques that we'll be looking at today will be applicable to those other Office applications as well. But you can imagine the difference would be, as I mentioned, that term, the object model. In Project, you have tasks and resources and assignments, but in Word, you have things like documents and words and paragraphs. So the things that you'll be programming will be different, but the basic syntax and structure of the language is very similar from one version to the next. Okay, so I think it's now time, as we say here frequently, to build a widget. And the first one we're going to take a look at in our example here today is creating an automated printing routine. So what I would like to be able to do is each week, each Friday, my manager asks me to produce some reports, one of which is show me just the things that are completed within a project. Okay, so remember we talked about how would we do that? How would we create a macro to do that? Well, the first thing is how would we do it manually? How would you accomplish something like that? So let's actually give that a try. I'm going to go into Microsoft Project. Let me just close Outlook for a second. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and open a project. Okay. And what I would like to be able to do, as I said, is I want to be able to produce a view that only shows me those tasks that are completed, and I want to be able to print that. So what are the manual steps to do that, I guess? So the first thing is, I mean, if I want to only show those tasks that are completed, I could use a filter to accomplish that, right? I could say, only show me those tasks where, and then how do you know if a task is done? Well, there's a couple ways you can know. One is if it's 100% complete, or if the actual finish date is not NA, that means it has an actual finish date, so therefore it ought to be done, right? So we can use either of those techniques, but essentially I want to apply a filter to only show me completed tasks, and then I want to make sure I'm in the right view, and then I want to print it. So those are the manual steps. So let's actually start our macro recorder. The way we go about doing that is we go to the View tab. There we go. The very last button there says Macros, and then click that button, and I'm going to choose Record Macro. All right, and I'm going to call this PW for Project Widgets Print Completed Tasks. Okay, and just to get started, I click OK, and now our macro recorder is running. So any of the steps I perform from this point forward are going to be recorded as part of the macro. So the first thing I want to be able to do is I want to make sure that we're in the right view. Then when we go to print it, right now you can see I'm in the task usage view. I want to be in the Gantt chart view. So I'm going to first click the button that says Gantt chart. There we go. Now we're in the Gantt chart view. And now I want to make it so that I only see completed tasks. So to do that, I'm going to go to where it says filters here, drop that down, and then I'm going to say, let's create a new filter. And what do I want to call that filter? So maybe I'll call it something like print completed tasks only. Okay? And then when you're building a filter, you always want to say, what is the criteria for that filter? Well, it's going to be, essentially think of it this way, only show me those tasks where some field, so in this case the field I want to look at is % complete. What kind of test do I want to perform? Equals 100. Okay, that's the value. So only show me those tasks where the % complete equals 100. Those ought to be the complete tasks. I will then click Apply. Okay, so notice that my filter is now applied, and I'm only seeing tasks that are complete. Now I want to print it, so I go to the File tab, and I'll select Print. All right, and I want to be able to adjust this a little bit so that I can get a little bit more of the Gantt chart on the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the little button here that says, or the link rather, that says Page Setup, and I will say Fit To, and I'll say 1 page wide, and then in terms of the number of pages, I always like put in a number that's significantly bigger than what I need, and which is fine. Then it will just, you know, in terms of the pages themselves, it'll print normally, but in terms of the width, this is what adjusts it so that it fits on a single page. So we'll just change that number to 10. Ought to be okay. Click OK. All right, notice that we're now getting not only the tabular area of the Gantt chart, but also the Gantt bars here as well. All right, and now I am just going to make it so it only prints the first page, and I'll click the print button, and you can hear in the background perhaps the printer actually printing this. And the last thing I want to do is, remember, when someone runs this macro, you don't want to leave them in the print completed tasks mode here, so you probably want to unapply your filter. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop that down, and I'll say no filter. There we go. So at this point, I think I've done everything I want to do. So now I'm just going to stop my recorder. I'm going to click Macros, Stop Recording, and there you have it. So let's take a look at the macro that just got recorded. I'm going to go into the VBA environment now, or the Visual Basic Editor as they call it. And I'll do that by clicking the Macros button, selecting Visual Basic. Okay, and this Module 1 right here is what was just recorded. All right, so let me take you through what this really means, and I think it'll look familiar to you. So notice that the macro is, in terms of the programming language, they actually refer to this as a subroutine. So it puts the word sub at the beginning, and then that's what we named it, right? PW, Project Completed Tasks. And these green lines here just show, those are comments. So it tells us when it was recorded and by whom. And we can add comments on our own as well, just by putting that little apostrophe character first. Then it turns that whole line green, and it's a great way to document what it was you were trying to do. All right, so let's actually put some hard returns in here, and we'll take a look at what this is doing. Okay, so this first line right here, this is where we apply the Gantt chart. Right, so I'm just putting a comment here, so when I look at this later on, this will make sense to me. Just as a reminder, there was a question, how did I get here? I'll just review that real quick. I'm going to go back to Microsoft Project just by clicking in the taskbar down below there. Right, so to get to the Visual Basic Editor, I clicked the Macros button, and then I just selected Visual Basic. So the Macros button, remember, is on the View tab. View, Macros, and then Visual Basic. That's how I got there. Okay, so let's put a comment in here. This is going to be build and apply the filter. So when I created that filter, that actually created something here, this line called the filter edit method. That is the line of code, that single line of code right there, built the filter for me. What is the name of the filter? It's called print completed tasks only. Is it a task filter? It is, so that's why you see the word true there. Should this be created as a new filter? That's why it says create : equals true. All right, so as you start to look through here, you can see the arguments that we used, or the other information, the parameters, like field name equals % complete, value equals 100. That's how we build our filter, right? So this is all captured here within the code. This next line here, file page setup, pages tall equals 10. So I'll just say format the page, and then this is where we actually did the print the view. All right, and once it's finished printing, notice it also says from page to page, right? So it captured that as well. And then finally, it's unapply the filter. Okay, so when you sort of break it apart like that, it makes a lot more sense, especially when you start to add your own comments. Then you can go back to here at any point and you can remember what it was that you were trying to accomplish. Okay, so I think it's in pretty good shape here. Now, one of the things I would like to do, and this is to me a good, or I should say a best practice really, before you run your macros, it's always a good idea to back them up, just in case something happens unforeseen. You'll have something saved, and believe me, I've benefited from this many times over the years. So notice over here on the left side of the screen something called Module 1. Well, a module, think of that as the container for your macros. So a given module can contain multiple macros. So I could add multiple routines that look like this all within the same module. So it just helps you organize your macros, so you take all your similar macros, put them all together in a module. So the other thing I can do too is rather than calling it module 1, I'm going to press the F4 function key. That's going to bring up the properties for the module, and I'm going to give it a better name. I'm going to call it MOD for module, and I'll call this PW webinar. Okay, and now I can back that up. The way I back it up is I just simply right-click on the module name, and I say export file, and you just select the location where you want it to go, click save, and now you have a backup. All right, so now what I would like to do is I'd like to test this macro. So I'm going to get back to Microsoft Project. Maybe I'm done with the code window for now. I can just hit that little X in the corner, and now I'm right back into Microsoft Project. And now I can test the macro. Well, how do I test it? Well, if I drop down the macros button, I can say view macros. I'll scroll on down, and I believe that was the one we just did. And I'm going to go ahead and click the run button. Okay. Nope. So wasn't expecting this to happen. It's giving me an error message that says ambiguous name detected. That means that I actually have a macro in my environment here that has the same name, this inflate work. So what I'm going to do is just temporarily, I'm going to comment this whole thing out. Hopefully I don't have any other ones in there like that. We'll find out in a second. No, I think that was the only one. Okay. Well, now you know how to deal with ambiguous macros. All right, so let's try this again. We're going to click macros, view macros, scroll on down, PW print completed tasks, and run. Notice it just very quickly applied the view. You can hear my printer going in the background, so it looks like it's doing exactly what we wanted it to do. So now the final step is I now want to make this available to run anytime I want in a more easy manner. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to the ribbon up top, and I'll show you the steps for doing that. We're going to go ahead and right mouse click in the ribbon area, and I'm going to say customize the ribbon. Okay. And by the way, I just want to mention that at the end of the session, if you would like to receive a copy of the code that we're producing in the course of this webinar, as well as the presentation, just shoot me an email. I'm going to show my email address at the end, and I'll be happy to send you all the custom code we create along with the presentation. Okay, so anyway, we're customizing the ribbon, so I brought this dialog box up, and what I want to do here is I want to create a brand new tab in the ribbon. So we do that by clicking the new tab button. Notice when I do that, it adds something called new tab and new group. Okay, so we just want to rename those. So I'm going to click new tab and then click the rename button here, and we're going to call this widgets. Click OK. And now where it says new group, we're going to rename that as well. And I'm going to call this the webinar widgets and click OK. So whenever you want to take any kind of custom functionality you've created via the macros, you always have to add that to your own custom tab within the ribbon. Okay, so that's why we're creating that new tab. And I am going to now add the macro that we just created. So you see where it says choose commands from. Popular commands, if I drop that down, there's all these other options like commands not in ribbon. That would be a good one to take a look at in your spare time. That's where you can get to all the other commands in Microsoft Project that are not ordinarily available to you from within any of the ribbons. So these are less frequently used functions. You can see what else Project can do. In our case, though, we're going to pick macros. And there's our macro PW print completed task. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to just click the Add button. There we go. So it just added it in. And now that I've added it, I can give it a little bit of a friendlier name just by clicking the Rename button. So let's just get rid of the PW, and we'll just call it Print Completed Tasks. And then we'll click OK. And I also, if I want to change the icon, I also do that through the Rename button. Here's where I could pick an icon that might be a little bit nicer than just the default one. So maybe since it's completed tasks, maybe we can pick the one with the little check mark. Click OK, click OK. And notice that we now have a tab that says Widgets. And notice on that tab, there's our group called Webinar Widgets. There's our button that says Print Completed Tasks. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And sure enough, it worked just fine. So we're well on our way here, folks, to adding all these cool new functions to Microsoft Project. Okay, so we are now ready to move on to our next example. So let's just go back to PowerPoint for a moment. And this next example is, how do we create a routine to inflate or deflate work by a specified percentage? Okay, so I guess the first thing we want to talk about is, why is this something that you would want to do? Well, oftentimes an organization uses templates, and they build those templates with, for the different types of projects that they work on, and they put the standard work breakdown structure within those templates, and they even sometimes assign generic resources to the tasks within that template. And when you assign those generic resources, you're then often going to estimate how much work does it typically take to perform that task. And that's what you're going to put in as the work value. So in fact, let me go ahead and just add the column here called work. I'll just right mouse click on one of these other columns, and I'll say insert a column, and I'll type in work, and there you have it. So here you can see the work that's currently associated to that task. Okay? So why would we want to have a tool that would help us adjust those work values? Well, suppose you start a new project from a template, but this particular project is of a much greater complexity than the typical project you work on. So those work estimates that you have are, very understated in the template compared to what they actually need to be for this real project that you're about to start on. So suppose, for example, we needed to increase the work for all the tasks by 50%. So instead of 8 hours here, we'd add an additional 4. That should turn into 12 hours, right? So yeah, we could go ahead and do that manually if we wanted to, but a macro would just make this a whole lot easier. So let me show you the technique for doing this. So first of all, this is one of those macros where we're actually not going to be recording it. We're actually going to create some very simple VBA code ourselves, and I'll show you how this can be done quite easily. So once again, we're going to go into the Visual Basic Editor. We click View, Macros, and we say Visual Basic. All right, and we'll go into our module that we created earlier, that mod PW webinar, and I want to create a new routine here, one of those new subroutines. So I started off with the word sub, okay, and then I just have to decide, what do I want to name this? So I'm going to call this inflate work, and I'll just add the word webinar at the end so I don't get one of those ambiguous names again. And then I'll press enter. And notice as soon as I do that, it actually puts in an end sub at the bottom, right? So all my code is going to go in between the sub and the end sub. Now, one of the things that I like to do is when I'm working with these macros is, right now we're working in what's called the full module view where when you're looking at this you can see all the macros kind of stacked together. But if you like to look at just one macro at a time, you can switch that by clicking the button here called the procedure view. So watch what happens when I click that. Right now I'm just looking at the new one that I'm creating. So I like to remove the clutter. All right. So the job of this macro that we're going to create now is going to be to loop through every task in the project one at a time. And we are going to say if whatever the work is on that task, let's increase it by 50%. So essentially we're creating this special kind of looping macro. And I'll show you how we're going to do that. First of all, we're going to be looping through tasks. So in order to reference each task as the macro runs, I actually have to do what's called declare a variable. And I have to give that variable a name. So I'm just going to say dim, that stands for dimension, T as task. All right, so basically what I'm saying is we're going to use this variable called T. That's what we're naming it. We can call it anything we want. And what is T going to be? T is a task. So task is one of those reserved objects within the macro language. So when you say T is a task, it knows all the things that you can do with that task, all the ways you can program it. Okay? So we're going to be putting some comments in as we go here. We're going to say loop through the tasks in the active project. And I'll just close my little Facebook message there. Okay. So the way we go about doing that is we say for each T in active project dot tasks. And then we close that off with a next T. So in essence what this is doing, this is creating a mechanism for us to be able to process one task at a time. That's what for each means. It essentially means for every task or for each task in my active project, do something with that task. That's what we're going to be putting inside here. And then when it says next T, that says now go back and get the next task and do that same thing again and do the next task until we're out of tasks. So this is a real convenient way of working with all the tasks in the project without having to know how many tasks you have in your plan. Okay? Okay, now this next line is going to say skip the blank tasks. And I have to put this line here that says if not T is nothing then. All right, so this is going to be an if and an end if. Now what does that do? Well, just what it says. It's going to skip the blank tasks. It's a syntax that you will get used to over time once you do this enough. But essentially what this is saying is if the task is not nothing, essentially meaning as long as we're actually on a task as opposed to a blank row. You know how you can insert blank rows in Microsoft Project? Well, if you're running your macro and you're running within one of these for each loops, when it hits a blank row, it's not going to know what to do unless you put in this line right here. So that just prevents blank rows from causing a problem. Okay. Now, one other thing that we want to do is we don't want to process summary tasks with this macro either. So I'm going to say skip summary tasks. Remember, in Microsoft Project, if I were to go to the work value at the summary level, that may not have the desired effect that I want. I actually want to be able to change the work at the individual subtask level. Okay, so to do that, I want to be real specific, skip the summary tasks. So we're going to say if T dot summary equals false, then, and then we close that off with another end if. All right, so now it's going to skip the summary task. So now we're finally at the point where we get to write the code to actually inflate the work. I'm going to say inflate the work by 50%. Okay, and the way we do that is we say T dot work is going to be equal to t.work times 1.5. Okay, so in essence what we're saying is the work field for the task that we're currently processing, t.work. Notice when I typed the period, Microsoft Project's VBA language brings up a whole list of things I can select from. So this is referred to as IntelliSense technology. But basically, I don't have to worry about even typing the word work. I can either pick it from the list, or if I type in the first couple of characters, it takes me right to the one I want, and then I just press the Tab key to select it, and now I know that I haven't made any typos. Okay? So I think this ought to do what we want it to do. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to, remember we said before you run it, we want to back it up. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click, and let's say Export File, back it up, and now we're ready to test it out. Okay, remember it's called Inflate Work Webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and close the VBA window, and just to prove that this worked, I'm going to insert a text field here. And text 1 ought to do it. And I'm going to take all the values that are in the current work column, copy them, and paste them into here, just so we can see what the work values were, just to prove that this really did do what we intended. Okay? And now what I'm going to do is run the macro. Remember how we do that? We say macros, view macros, inflate work webinar. So if this works, what would we expect? Well, we'd expect that 8 to turn into a 12, that 16 to turn into a 24. Let's see if it works. We're going to go ahead and click Run. And it looks like it did the job. Notice what was 8 is now 12, what was 16 is now 24. There you go. So I would say we achieved what we were looking to do. So there you have it, folks. That's the basic technique, and you can do a variety of things with that same structure. Remember, whenever you want to loop through the project and perform an operation on an individual task, you can use that for each structure that we looked at. What if we wanted to deflate the work? What if, again, same concept, we're starting off with a template, but this time the person that we're hiring is extremely experienced, so it's going to take them half the time to do what they need to do. Well, you could build a macro, and instead of multiplying the work by 1.5, you could multiply it by 0.5, right? And that will essentially divide the work in half. Same concept. Okay? So really, we're just kind of scratching the surface of the capabilities here. I just want to get the point across that anything you can do manually in Project, this macro language should make it a whole lot easier. Okay? So let's go ahead and move on to our next example. And our next example is going to be importing information from Microsoft Excel. Well, this particular request actually came from one of the attendees on the webinar. We asked people who signed up if there was anything in particular that you'd like to see me cover today, and one of the requests was, they didn't quite ask for it this way, but what they said was, is there any way to be able to import actual work from another system? So it's quite common that organizations use Microsoft Project, but from a time tracking perspective, they use some other system to try to track the time associated with projects. And then they'd like to be able to reflect that time in Microsoft Project. Well, of course, you could, maybe rekey that information in, but again, it'd be a lot easier if we could somehow automate that. So one of the things that a lot of these systems can do is they can export information to a Microsoft Excel file. So if we could get those actual hours in an Excel file and figure out some way of getting Microsoft Project to read that Excel file, then we should be able to automate this as well. And that's exactly what we're going to take a look at. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this project for now. All right. And let me go ahead and open up another project here. Excuse me. And this is called Project Widgets Actual Hours. All right, so here's a simple project I created with 5 tasks: analyze, design, build, test, and implement. And notice the resources we have working on those tasks. Depending on the age of my attendees, some of you may or may not recognize those names, but hopefully most of you do. So we have John, Paul, George, and Ringo working on these tasks, and I want to be able to bring in their actual work from this other system. And I was able to actually export this data to an Excel file. And let me show you what that looks like. So we're going to launch Excel. And this represents the export from the time tracking system. So notice it has a row here that says, here's the name of the project, here's the name of the task. Notice that we're also showing here something called Task Unique ID. So that's a field that's available in Microsoft Project. In fact, if I go back to this project, I can insert the column called Unique ID. And notice that each task here at the task level, these italicized rows, these are referred to as assignments. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But each task has its own unique ID, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the nice thing about a unique ID is that that unique ID always stays with the task. So even if I were to move it around or insert other tasks in between, that although the ID of a task will change, its unique ID will never change. All right, so if you need to be sure that you're referencing that specific task, the unique ID is a good way to do that. Okay, so notice that's why I'm referencing these unique IDs here. That gets me a pointer back to the task. There's the resource name. That's how I know the name of the person that I'm trying to get those actual hours assigned to. So in essence, what this file is telling me is that on the task called Analyze, the resource named John Lennon has a total actual work of 32 hours that's being pulled from that other system. And there's Paul's and George's hours. Now we're moving on to the design task, and you can see the resource and how many hours. Okay, so this is my data source. So how do we get Microsoft Project to read this data source? Well, let me show you. Let me go in. Now this one you're not actually going to see me build from scratch. I'm going to show you the pre-made macro that I created. And that is called import task total actual hours. Now this isn't one of those macros that you can record. This is one that you have to write. But the good news for you is that as long as you understand this conceptually, I'm going to provide this code to you so that you'll be able to refer to it and work with it and try some other things out. Okay, so let me just kind of walk you through what the job of this code is. First of all, notice this says Start Microsoft Excel. That's what this line of code does right here. Set obj Excel equal to new Excel.application. In essence, what that's saying is create a new instance of Microsoft Excel programmatically. Start her up. That's what that does. You have very similar syntax if you were starting Outlook or PowerPoint or Word. In this case, it's Excel.application. Once it's started, we're going to be able to reference this variable here called obj Excel. That's how we're going to be able to programmatically work with the Excel application that we're just started. This line right here says not only start it, but make it visible. Visible equals true. Because if I just start it, it's actually going to be running in the background, which sometimes you may want to do that. You may not want the user to actually see Excel. Maybe you just want to get the data from it. And when you're done, go ahead and close it. Okay, in this case, we'll say visible equals true. This line of code right here says workbooks.open. That essentially says go ahead and open up the workbook, and file name : equals. That's the name of the file and its location that we want to be able to open. Okay. Once we have that file open, we are going to reference the active worksheet. So when we were looking at that Excel file before, that worksheet that had all our data on it, this line of code allows us to work with that active worksheet. Okay? All right, so now this is where we get to loop through, just like we loop through all the tasks in the project, this is where we're going to loop through all the rows in our Microsoft Excel file. And we do this within something called a do loop. See the word do here and then the word loop here. In essence, what that says is very much like the for each loop that we had in project. This says between the do and the loop, run all of these lines of code. And then when you get to the end, to the word loop again, go back to the top and do it again. But notice what we're doing is at the very bottom of this loop, we're actually incrementing this row number here. I equals I plus 1, so I is actually an integer variable. Notice I equals an integer. And we're going to each time add 1 to that integer, which is then going to move down to the next row in Excel, and then move down to the next row in Excel until we have this little test up here that says if we encounter a blank row, then exit do, meaning we're done, exit out of this do loop, and our job is done. So it's a little bit of a different kind of structure than the for each, but conceptually it's kind of doing the same thing. Okay, now what else are we doing here? This line of code right here says set a reference to the task in Microsoft Project. So remember we specified the unique ID of the task in the Excel file? Well, this line of code right here says set our task variable equal to the task in Microsoft Project that we're working with, the active project, that has the unique ID specified in that Excel file, that obj Excel cells here. This is referencing the row and the column, which is really the cell address, right? It tells me it's on this row. The row in this case is I, which is starting off as 1. Well, actually, we're starting it off at 2. We're starting on the second row, and then each time we're incrementing it, okay? So there's my row, there's my column. That's the column that contains the data that I want, all right? So this line here is now referencing the task in Microsoft Project that has the unique ID specified in Excel. Once we're there, we are going to now loop through the assignments on the task. So let's go back to project for a second. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's the task called Analyze. These italicized rows below it, these are referred to as assignments in Microsoft Project. In essence, what that means is that person is assigned to the task. So they call it an assignment. So that's the level in which I want to be able to bring my data in at that assignment level. Okay, so in essence, when I read my Excel file for the task called Analyze, for the resource called John Lennon, if he's assigned to the task, put his actual hours right there. Okay, so that's what this section of code right here is doing. It's looping through the assignments on that task. And what we're doing now, we're saying is if that assignment's name equals that name that was specified in Excel, then we know we have the correct assignment, right? So if a.resource name, that's the assignment's resource name, is equal to the data that's in that row in column 4 in Excel, that's where we had the resource name, then we know we're on the right one. Set the actual work for that assignment. Let me just put that comment in. Set actual work for assignment. Okay, so we're saying a.actual work, so set that assignment's actual work equal to whatever was in that column in Excel, the 5th column. But notice I'm doing something kind of interesting here. I'm multiplying that value by 60. Well, why do I need to do that? Well, this is just something that you need to be aware of when you're working programmatically with Microsoft Project and we're working with the field called work or actual work or any kind of work field. Work is always specified in minutes in Microsoft Project. So since the work that we were getting from Excel is in hours, I need to be able to, I need to convert that to minutes within the VBA here. So that's what this times 60 does for me. Once I make that assignment, I exit my for loop here, and then I can increment my row in Excel and then go back to the top and process the next row in Excel. All right, so that's what that's doing for me. Let's actually give this a try and see if it works. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this. I'm going to close my, this is called import task total actual hours. So I'm going to go to my macros, view macros, and import task total actual hours. Let's go ahead and let her rip here. We're going to click run. It should launch Microsoft Excel. There it goes. Opens the file and brings in the actual hours. Look at that, folks. It did exactly what we wanted it to do. Let's just spot check it. Always a good idea to test your work, make sure it did what you wanted. So here you can see that for the task called Analyze, the resource name John Lennon should have had 32 hours. Analyze, John Lennon, 32 hours. There you go. And we do a little more testing, of course, before we are ready to push this out to production. But you get the general idea, right? We're now able to launch Excel, read an Excel file, and bring that data into Microsoft Project. And again, this is a really, really simple kind of use case. What if, some of you may be thinking, well, that's kind of nice that we can bring in the actual work. In fact, somebody, I believe, has asked this question online. But what if that work is specified by month? You know, what if you don't just want to bring in the total actual work? What if you want to bring in, here's the actual work for January, here's the actual work for February, that sort of thing. Can we do that? Well, the answer is, of course, yes. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this line by line, but I will show you an example. Let me, first of all, clear out the actual work here. So we're back to 0 hours of actual work. And I created a different Excel file that I'd like to show you, anticipating that I might get this question. Just have to remember where I put it. Here we go. It ought to be on my C drive, in my data folder. There we go. And this is called Project Widgets Monthly Actual Hours. Someone asked a question, can we also do it by week? And the answer is absolutely yes. We can do it by week. We can do it by day. We could do it by quarter, year. Doesn't matter. It can handle it all. All right, so in this particular example, I am specifying my work in months. You can see January, February, March, April, May. So the Excel file is structured a little bit differently now. Let me go ahead and close this, and I'll just give you a quick peek at the code here. This routine is going to be called import task monthly actual hours, right? So the difference is, everything's basically the same. The difference is the technique that we're using. We're using something in our code here, and again, I will send this to you. It's called the timescale data method. Rather than just saying a.actual work like I did before, this timescale data method allows us to specify the start date, the end date, so essentially the date range of what we want. The type of data, in this case, it's called PJ assignment timescale actual work. And of course, the online help file will tell you all the different possible values you can use for that. But in this case, that's exactly what we want, time-scaled actual work, meaning time-scale meaning broken down into time periods. What is that time period? What's the time-scale unit? It's PJ time-scale months. You can imagine if you wanted to do it in weeks, there's also, you can see here, time-scale, how did I lie? There's days, there's months, yeah, there's weeks, time-scale weeks, okay? So yes, you can do that. Just pick the appropriate time-scale value. Let's go back to months. And then it says count. Count equals 1. Essentially what that means is we're going to do 1 month at a time. All right, so you can see I have the line of code in here for January, February, March, April, May, etc. And that shows you the basic syntax. Let me go ahead and close this. Let me go ahead and run it. View macros. Import task monthly actual hours. Click run. It's going to open Excel. And this time what it did is it brought in all those hours specified and put them in the appropriate month. Okay, so there you go. So hopefully that gives you an idea of, you know, the kinds of things the project can do in an automated fashion. It'll give you the kind of the basics, and then from there you can create much more sophisticated automation. You know, maybe there's a lot of conditional logic or you know, that you can build right into it, but the fundamentals are there. Okay, very good. Just a couple more topics to cover, and then we'll wrap it up. Hope you don't mind. For those of you that can maybe just stay a little bit beyond the hour, we might go about 5 minutes over if that's okay. I encourage you to all do that. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is, now you've created these wonderful macros. How do you distribute these to your users? I just want to apologize. We did not have enough time in the hour to do the Zoom text widget, so I won't be able to go through that. However, I will be sending you the sample code for that if you request it, and it is something you can also download from our website. If you got to our website, just go to our downloads page. You can request the Zoom text widget. We also have something called the Hammock task widget, the arrange windows side by side widget. So those are all free and you can download them right from our website. Okay, so distributing your macros. Let's talk about that. So we've done a lot of good macros today, and now you'd like to make them available to other users within your organization. So really it's pretty easy to do that. Remember, the macros are contained within modules, right? We saw that earlier in the webinar. All your macros can live in a single module or potentially multiple modules. In essence, what we need to do is figure out a way to copy those modules to another user's computer. That's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is, how do we get the ribbon buttons to show up as well? And sometimes, depending on the macro, there may be things like views, tables, filters that you are referencing as part of your macro, so you may sometimes need to bring those over as well. So your macro, if it's using a particular view, you can bring it along with your automation so it's able to find that view. Well, the way we go about doing that is we can actually copy all those things, except the ribbon changes. I'll talk about that in a second. But the modules, the views, the tables, filters, we can actually copy them into a project file. In other words, just a regular old MPP file, save them all to the MPP file via what's called the organizer, and then we take that MPP file, open it up on your user's computer, and we kind of go in the opposite direction. We copy the views, tables, filters, the macros from that MPP file then into your user's computer. So let me just show you what that could look like. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. Should do this in Microsoft Project. There we go. Let's create a new project. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll just save it to my desktop. And I'll call this My Widgets. All right, it's just a blank project called My Widgets. I'm then going to go to the File tab, select Info, and then select Organizer. I then click on Modules, and here's a list of all the modules I have in my environment. I'm going to go ahead and pick the one that we created today, which is called Mod PW Webinar, and I'm going to copy it into the MPP file. All right, so now my MPP file contains all of my modules. I then save this, and we're good to go. Now I'm going to email this or put it out on my network where other users can get to it. They will then be able to open this file, and you're going to go in the opposite direction. They'll open it. You'll go to File, Organizer, and this time, when we click on Modules, we'll select the module contained within My Widgets, and we'll just click the Copy button to bring it over into what's called their Global MPT. And now all the macros that we created during this session are installed on your user's computer. Okay. Now, how do you get your ribbon changes over to them? Remember the widgets button right here? Let's say you've created a bunch of buttons. How would you give them those buttons? Well, the easiest way to do that is to, if you right mouse click in the ribbon area, go to customize the ribbon, and then just simply say import export, and you'll say export all customizations. I'll save this out to my desktop, and I'm just going to call this again my widgets. There we go. So now that's exported to the desktop. You would then copy that file or email that to your user. They in turn would go to this same dialog box, only they're going to say import customization file. My widgets, click open, and it does give you a warning. It says all existing customizations you've previously made to the ribbon will be replaced. You just have to be careful that the user hasn't already customized the ribbon. But assuming they have not, then just say yes here, click OK, and now they will have the widgets tab along with the buttons, along with all your macros. Okay? Very good. So we're just going to take a few more minutes before we wrap up. I will just give you a quick peek at something we call our project initiation widget. This is an offering that we have. It's not one of the free ones, but hopefully you'll find it to be valuable. I'll be happy to give you more information about it if you'd like. But essentially what it does is it provides a method, a consistent method for users within your organization to initiate a project. It will leverage your existing templates. It'll enforce your project naming conventions. It'll allow you to enter the metadata for a project. And one other thing that it does, as I will show you, it's going to allow you to specify what tasks you'd like to be able to include in the new project that you're creating. So just bear with me for 1 second here, folks. I'm just going into my demo environment. And we'll get a demo of the project initiation widget in just a moment. Okay, so we're in the Project Widgets demo environment right now. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, new blank project, and in a moment you'll see there's the Project Widgets tab, and I'm going to click the button here called Project Initiation Widget. Okay, and this brings up what we refer to as the initiation widget, and this is a tool that makes it easier for people to initiate a new project. It can be tied to your template, so notice where it says what type of project are we initiating. I'm going to say we're going to do a new implementation project. Okay, so this is all data-driven. It's all looking at the templates that you have. And in this particular initiation widget, this is not intended to be shrink wrap, by the way. This is something that's kind of more of a custom offering that we have. We actually build this to your specifications, but this kind of provides the framework and gives you an idea of the kinds of things that the initiation widget can do. So notice once I pick the type of project, I can answer any other fields here, like what contract type is it, or who's the project manager, who's the sponsor. So any of the custom fields that you'd like to be able to show here can appear right here on the initiation widget. Now this particular initiation widget, we utilize something we're referring to as a work stream. So for example, what I can do is, suppose we're going to be building a project and we have different groups within our company participating. Maybe the finance group is participating. Notice as I type finance and then press tab, we see the finance tab appear here. And suppose also our manufacturing group is participating in this project. So you basically type in all the different groups that will be participating in this project, and as you do, you see a new tab appear here. So this is really where the power of the initiation widget comes in. This screen here is built from your template, from the template you've selected, and this is going to allow the user to select what should be included for this project. So for example, notice there's a check mark next to monitor change management activities. If that should be included in the new project, I simply put a check mark there. If I don't want to include it, I uncheck it. So it allows me to very easily decide what should go in a project versus what should not go in. So we refer to these as optional activities, and it's all configurable. You can determine from your template which tasks should be optional. And if they're flagged as optional, then the little checkbox will appear there. Notice prototype 1 doesn't have a checkbox, so it's not optional. We're definitely going to be doing a prototype, but look, I have the ability to actually do more than one prototype, right? So I could actually change that to something other than a one. I can specify the quantity of how many of those we will be doing. And depending on what number I put in there, it'll actually replicate that section of activities the number of times that I specify. Notice that we also have this button here that says select, deselect all. Now, if I just know I'm going to do everything within this first finance work stream we're going to be doing exactly as is, I'll just do select all. But let's actually change around manufacturing a little bit. For manufacturing, we'll go ahead and say, yes, we are doing the first one, but for the prototype, we're going to do 2 prototypes. Under construction, yeah, we'll do the monitor change management activities, but each of these, the testing tasks, we're going to do them twice also. So I change my quantity to 2. Under transition, notice I'm not going to check the first one, but the second one I will check, training my end users. Okay, and I'm going to say we're going to be doing 3 separate training sessions because we have 3 groups of users that we want to be able to train. So we want to make sure that those activities are in there 3 times. Under optimize, I'll do my conduct optimization review, but I will not, in this case, do the monitor change management activities. All right, so you get the idea. We're selecting from the optional tasks what's in or what's out, and for the others, we're saying how many of these do we want to be able to do. For those tasks that we're not selecting, we have a choice when we create this initiation widget for you of either deleting those tasks so that they don't actually appear in the project, or we could choose to deactivate those tasks. So in this particular case, I chose to deactivate them. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Create Project button. This is now going to open up the template associated with the project, make all the changes that I specified in the initiation widget, click OK, and notice that we now have a project. There's our finance section, there's our manufacturing section. If we take a look at the manufacturing section, notice we said we wanted to have 2 prototypes. There they are, prototype 1, prototype 2. As I scroll down, notice we wanted to have 2 groups of testing tasks. There they are, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. And as I scroll down further, notice that the activities I unchecked that I said I did not want to include in the project as active tasks, in this particular case, we deactivated them. That's why they showed up with that grayed out appearance there. So notice that it just makes it a whole lot easier to initiate a new project no matter the level of experience of the user. It utilizes your templates, they answer some questions, and you get a project in the way that you intended it to be created. Okay, so that's something we call our project initiation widget. If you would like me to, if you'd like to talk about that in more detail with me, please just send me an email and I'd be happy to discuss what it would take to create one of these for your organization. Excuse me. And with that, folks, I notice a couple of questions did come in. We're just about to wrap up here. While we're answering the questions, I'll just leave this screen up here. Again, my name is Ira Brown, and I'm the president of Project Widgets. You can reach me at ira.brown@projectwidgets.com. You can visit our website at the address shown there. Love to hear from you. Also email me if you would like me to send you the code samples that we created during this session, as well as the presentation. I would be happy to do so. So a question did come in: can the project initiation widget integrate with WBS Schedule Pro to utilize the WBS structure? Well, I would have to tell you that I do not know the answer to that question. I know that's another add-on tool for Microsoft Project. Right now we work with Microsoft Project templates. By the way, it can work with standalone templates, or it could work with Project Server or Project Online templates. But if it can work with WBS Schedule Pro, I would have to investigate that. Don't know much about that product and what its capabilities are, but maybe it's an opportunity for me to come up with an offering that can. So we'll look into that after this webinar. I think we've answered the other questions as we've gone here. So with that, folks, if you think of anything else, any other questions you have, feel free to email me. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for attending today's session. Hope you learned some interesting things about macros and, really just kind of gave you a flavor for what's possible. And what we'd like to say here is kind of our motto: if you can imagine it, we can build it. So let us know if there's anything that we could help you with. If you don't want to necessarily do this yourself, but you'd like to work with us to build some of this kind of automation for your company, that's exactly what we do. That's why we're in business. So look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again for attending today's session. And that's all we have for now. Have a great day, everybody.